Some moments don't feel important when they happen. They don't announce themselves with urgency or drama. They arrive quietly, almost politely, as if asking permission to matter. And yet, years later, they stand out with a clarity that feels almost cruel. For Ronald Reagan, the day he finally spoke was one of those moments. He was older now. Not old, but no longer young enough to believe that time would automatically fix what silence had broken. Life had taught him that lessons don't disappear just because you ignore them. They wait, patiently, faithfully, until you're ready. That morning began like many others. Reagan finished his broadcast, moved his headphones, and sat still for a moment longer than necessary. The studio was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than empty. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, unaware that anything meaningful was about to happen. He stood, adjusted his coat, and stepped into the street. Walking had always helped him think. It slowed the world down just enough for his thoughts to catch up. As he moved through the familiar blocks, he noticed things he had learned not to rush past. The shopkeeper carefully rearranging a display no one seemed to notice. The man sitting alone on a bench feeding crumbs to pigeons. The woman pausing mid-step, as if unsure where she was headed. Years ago, Reagan might have passed them without reflection. Not anymore. He had learned that these small pauses, these hesitations, often meant something. That was when he heard his name. Mr. Reagan. The voice was uncertain but steady. He turned. A young man stood a few feet away, hat in hand. Early 30s, maybe? Clean-shaven, neatly dressed, but worn in a way that suggested effort rather than neglect. There was something familiar about him, though Reagan was sure they had never met. "Yes," Reagan replied. "I hope I'm not bothering you," the man said quickly. I wanted to say thank you." Reagan frowned slightly. "For what?" The man hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "You don't remember me," he said. "That's all right, you wouldn't." Reagan studied him. "Go on." The man took a breath. "A few years ago I worked at the station. It's part-time. I was young, nervous. I said something in a meeting I probably shouldn't have." Reagan's expression softened. "I remember meetings," he said gently. "They can be unforgiving places." The man smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." "I raised a concern. Something small, really. Everyone wanted to move on, but you didn't." Reagan felt a quiet stir of recognition. "You asked me to finish?" the man continued. "You said it mattered that I'd be heard." Reagan nodded slowly. "I'm glad." The man's voice wavered slightly. "You probably don't know this, but that moment changed things for me." Reagan looked at him more closely now. "I almost quit that day," the man admitted. "I felt invisible. I didn't belong in rooms where decisions were made. But when you spoke up, it was the first time I felt like my voice had weight." The words settled over Reagan like a familiar ache, one that no longer hurt as sharply as it once had, but still carried meaning. "I didn't do much," Reagan said. "You did enough," the man replied. They stood there, the city flowing around them. "I wanted to thank you," the man said again. "Because I stayed. I kept speaking, and things worked out." Reagan smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that." The man nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else," he said. "I've always wondered why you spoke up that day." Reagan didn't answer immediately. The question touched something deep, something old. "Because I learned what happens when you don't," Reagan said quietly. The man studied him, sensing there was more behind the words. Reagan met his gaze. "Some lessons take time," he added. They shook hands, and the man walked away, shoulders lighter than when he had arrived. Reagan remained where he was. He continued walking, but his pace slowed. The encounter had stirred something he hadn't expected, not pride, not satisfaction, but a strange sense of alignment, as though a long-standing imbalance had shifted, just slightly, toward center. Years ago, he had stood in silence when a man needed to be heard. He had carried that silence with him, shaping himself around it, learning from its weight. Today he had spoken, and someone had noticed. Reagan found himself thinking back to that earlier version of himself, The young man who believed it wasn't his place to intervene, who thought responsibility belonged to someone else, who mistook caution for wisdom. He had learned since then that responsibility doesn't always arrive with authority. Sometimes it arrives with proximity. If you are close enough to hear someone, you are close enough to matter. That understanding had come slowly, painfully. But it had come. Later that afternoon, Reagan attended a meeting that would have once made him uncomfortable. A disagreement unfolded, voices tightening, impatience creeping in. A junior member tried to interject, then fell silent when interrupted. The room moved on. Reagan felt the familiar tension rise, but this time it didn't paralyze him. "Hold on," he said calmly. Let him finish. The junior member looked up, surprised. He spoke. The issue was resolved, not dramatically, not perfectly, but fairly. No one applauded. No headlines followed, and yet Reagan felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. This was it. Not the grand gestures, not the speeches, the moments where you choose to speak because silence would cost someone something you can't afford to lose. As evening approached, Reagan walked home with a lighter step. He thought about the man who had thanked him, about the way his voice had steadied as he spoke, about the life that had continued because someone had intervened, not heroically, but humanly. He also thought about the man from years ago, the one he had not spoken for, the one whose name he had carried in silence. He could not change that moment, but he could honor it by choosing differently now. That night, Reagan sat alone at his table reflecting. He realized something he had not allowed himself to believe before. Speaking does not erase regret, but it can transform it into purpose. The past does not ask to be rewritten. It asks to be understood, and sometimes to be answered not in words, but in action. Reagan leaned back in his chair, the room quiet around him. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt complete. Ronald Reagan walked the rest of that afternoon with a strange sensation he could not immediately name. It wasn't pride, and it wasn't relief. It felt more like balance, the quiet sense that something long misaligned had finally found its place. The man who had thanked him was gone now, absorbed back into the anonymous rhythm of the city. Reagan doubted he would ever see him again, and yet the encounter felt unfinished in the best possible way. It didn't ask for reflection. It didn't demand analysis. It simply existed, complete in itself. For years, Reagan had carried memories that ended in silence, conversations that dissolved into regret, moments where words gathered at the back of his throat and never found their way out. Those moments had shaped him, yes, but they had also weighed on him. This one felt different. This one felt like an answer. That evening, Reagan attended a small gathering, nothing formal, just colleagues and acquaintances sharing a meal after work. The room was filled with familiar sounds, clinking glasses, low laughter, half-finished thoughts drifting from one conversation to the next. He listened more than he spoke. At one point, a disagreement surfaced between two men at the table. It wasn't serious, but it carried the tension of unspoken frustrations. One man spoke confidently, dominating the exchange. The other tried twice to interject, only to fall silent each time. Years ago, Reagan might have let the conversation move on. He felt the old instinct stirred the reflex to avoid interference, to let things resolve themselves. But now that instinct was accompanied by something else, awareness. "Hold on," Reagan said calmly. I think he was trying to say something. The table quieted. The man looked up, surprised. Well, it's nothing important." Reagan shook his head gently. "If it wasn't important, you wouldn't have tried twice." The man hesitated, then spoke. The conversation shifted not dramatically, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Misunderstandings softened. The tension eased. Later, as Reagan walked home, he realized something that stopped him mid-step. Speaking no longer felt like crossing a line. It felt like standing where he belonged. In the weeks that followed, this pattern repeated itself in small, unremarkable ways. Reagan spoke when others hesitated. He paused conversations that rushed past discomfort. He asked questions that slowed things down just enough for people to feel included. No one applauded these moments. No one commented on them. But Reagan noticed something else. People stayed. They stayed in conversations longer. They stayed in meetings instead of withdrawing. They stayed in situations where they might once have quietly stepped away. It reminded him of the man who had thanked him, the one who said he had almost quit. Reagan understood that feeling now more than ever. One afternoon, Reagan received a letter. It was handwritten, careful. The words pressed firmly into the paper as if the writer wanted to be sure they stayed. The return address was unfamiliar. The letter was short. Mr. Reagan. You don't know me well, but I was in a meeting years ago where you stopped things long enough for me to speak. I've never forgotten that. I didn't say it then, but it mattered more than you knew. Reagan folded the letter slowly. He didn't remember the meeting. He didn't remember the face, but he remembered the choice. That was enough. As Reagan's responsibilities grew, so did the consequences of his silence or his speech. The scale changed. The stakes grew heavier, but the principle remained remarkably consistent. Speaking wasn't about control. It was about acknowledgement. He found that leadership, at its core, was not the act of directing others, but the willingness to pause for them, to create space where someone else's voice could exist without interruption or dismissal. This understanding followed him into rooms that once intimidated him. In early political meetings, when discussions moved too quickly, Reagan slowed them. When conclusions were drawn too icily, he asked for clarification. When someone was brushed aside, he circled back. Some colleagues admired this, others found it inconvenient. Reagan accepted both reactions. He had learned that doing the right thing did not always feel efficient. There were nights when Reagan thought about the earlier chapters of his life, the moments when he had stayed silent and watched opportunities for connection slip past. Those memories had once been sharp, accusatory now. They felt instructive. He no longer wished to erase them. They had taught him what silence cost, and they had prepared him to understand what speaking could offer. Years later, during a particularly tense period of public life, Reagan found himself alone in a quiet office after a long day. The building had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of lights and distant traffic. He sat at his desk, reviewing notes, when a memory surfaced unexpectedly. The man on the street, the handshake, the simple thank you. Reagan leaned back and closed his eyes. He realized something that surprised him. That moment had not redeemed the past. It had reframed it. He understood. Now that growth did not require erasing mistakes. It required responding to them. One of the most difficult lessons Reagan learned was that speaking did not guarantee outcomes. Sometimes, even when he spoke, things did not improve. People were still hurt. Systems still failed. But he had come to see that outcome was not the measure integrity was. There was a profound the difference between failing after trying and failing after remaining silent. One left room for dignity. The other did not. As Reagan aged, he grew more comfortable with reflection. He spoke less in general, but with greater intention. He learned to value pause as not as avoidance, but as preparation. In conversation, he listened deeply. He let others finish. He resisted the urge to fill every gap with reassurance or explanation. When he did speak, his words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were timely. Those closest to him noticed the change. You don't rush anymore, one friend remarked. Reagan smiled. I used to think rushing meant caring. What does caring mean now? The friend asked. Reagan considered this. Staying, he said. Long enough to hear what's actually being said? Near the end of his life, Reagan reflected often on how much of existence unfolded in these quiet exchanges. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in hallways, street corners, meeting rooms, places where decisions were made without fanfare. He had once believed that history was shaped by bold actions alone. Now he understood that history was also shaped by pauses, by moments where someone decided not to look away. If someone were to ask him what changed him most, not the events, not the titles, not the acclaim, he might have struggled to answer, because the truth was simple. Almost too simple to sound meaningful. He learned to speak, not constantly, not impulsively, but when it mattered. And that made all the difference. The day Reagan finally spoke, did not stand out to the world. But it stood out to him because it marked the moment he stopped carrying silence as a burden and began carrying it as a tool. Silence could still be powerful, but now it was his choice. In the end, Reagan understood that life does not give us infinite chances to correct ourselves, but it does give us moments, small fleeting moments where we can choose differently. And sometimes, choosing differently is enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that growth is possible at any age, feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. These stories live on because people choose to listen and to speak. Thank you.